right, everyone, welcome again to another edition of Fermentology. I see the count is starting to slow down a little bit here. Hi, everybody on YouTube. Hi, everybody on Zoom. I think it's time to get this party started. All right. Yep, still a few counts there. Great. Okay, I see everyone. Fantastic. All right, again, welcome to yet another edition of Fermentology. It's our mini seminar series on the culture, science, and the history of our everyday fermented foods. And again, I'll just reiterate, as I always do, that we've had guests from everywhere across the world. And if you're looking for any of the previous fermentology talks, they're all on the Applied Ecology YouTube page. You just have to look up Applied Ecology in YouTube, or just type in the word fermentology in YouTube and they'll all come up. And today we have a really special guest. It's been a long time in the making to get Karl on the fermentology series. But Karl, the sourdough librarian, is going to be walking us through the science behind his collection of 130-ish starters from 25 countries and the really important work he's doing with those. As always, we will have a Q&A at the end of the chat. So whether you're watching on YouTube or Zoom, find whichever chat box is in front of you and pop your questions in as you have them. If you're tuning in on Zoom, that's the little Q&A box that's down in the right-hand corner there. Click on that and throw your question in there. I probably won't be able to get to everybody's questions today just because of the sheer volume, but please include your questions and I'll ask them at the end. So without any further ado, Karl, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Michelle. And thank you for having me here. I will say tonight, because it's already 10 o'clock in the evening, where I am located now. For you, it's probably a bit earlier, but who knows wherever else the rest of the viewers are, I have no idea. So I hope many of you are watching. And well, I'm pleased to introduce you to the one and only sourdough library here located in Belgium, in the eastern part of the country, very close to the border with Germany. And this is probably one of the most unique places within the bakery world, because yes, it's a unique location that we have inaugurated back in 2013. So we have already a couple of years behind us, and hopefully many, many more beautiful years ahead of us. Now, the thing with this sourdough library is that we created that library because we had a broad collection of sourdoughs already in-house, because we had done a couple of studies on a sourdough, because sourdough is, of course, one of these very traditional ingredients that are used into the baking business that have, well, actually disappeared. Sourdough has been around for more than 5,000 years. Some sources say 14,000. I recently discovered from people in Australia that they found back breads that date to 18,000 years ago. But what we believe is that all these generations of bakers that have baked bread wherever on earth, whatever recipes, whatever ingredients or raw materials they had available, they've probably always tried to bake the best breads in that they could. And what we are doing today is still that, trying to make better bread than what we did yesterday. And therefore, we believe that this sourdough library will help us reincorporate that ingredient that has been around for so many years back into the baker's life, because we have to be honest, and sourdough is an ingredient that has disappeared over the last 150 years since commercial yeast made its entrance within the bakery world. Many bakers stopped making a sourdough, maintaining it, and they switched massively to the use of yeast, because it made their breads fast, or they were able to make bread fast. They were able to make more breads in the same amount of time and feed more people. So it was a kind of a miracle product that has been widely adopted. And as such, the knowledge of making sourdough has well, has not been transmitted the way it could have or it should have. So with this library, we try to, again, achieve knowledge, acquire knowledge that we can again disperse or distribute back into the bakeries, so that we start again using that ingredient, because we see and we know from recent studies, and still there is a lot of studies ongoing, that sourdough is really a very important ingredient in order to increase the healthy halo of a bread, or to increase the nutritional values of a bread, or just to make a bread more digestible for people who suffer from bad digestion when they eat breads, or that bloating effect, and so on. With sourdough, we see that this is not happening, or happening less, unless you are celiac disease. Of course, then we cannot help you even with sourdough in the recipe. So we started studying sourdoughs. The very first sample we collected was back in 1989 within the company. I work for the company Purados. We are a worldwide ingredient supplier for bakery, patisserie, and chocolate. We exist since 1919. And in 1989, we collected the first sample of sourdough from San Francisco that was brought back by a colleague who retired last year. He worked all these years for us in the long-term research department. And when I started to work within this company in 1994, it was the very first sourdough I discovered and I saw in my life. I was a trained baker, pâtissier, chocolatier here in Belgium. I worked 6 years in a patisserie in Brussels, and in school, or even in that bakery or patisserie, we never saw a sourdough. We never learned what it was. We never used it. So I discovered it, and I'm going to take it. It's standing right here. It's number 43. And when I started, one of my very first tasks was to refresh that sourdough, to feed it with flour and water, to ferment it. And it was a new world opening to me, because it smelled funky. It was nice. It was something I'd never smelled before. And I baked my very first sourdough bread with that starter. So I have a special relationship. When people ask me which one is your favorite, I do not have favorites, because it's like asking a parent which child is your favorite. But with this one, I have a special relationship, because it was the first one. They say the first one you never forget, but this one I will never forget, of course. So that was the first one we collected. And then over the years, we started to acquire a sourdough from a region in the south of Italy called Altamura, that was already renowned 2,000 years ago, described by a Roman poet called Horace. And he said, whenever you are in the region of Apulia, you should take bread with you for your onward journey, because it's the best bread you can find within the Roman Empire. And as such, we were intrigued by that story, and we've been in that town, and we collected sourdough, and we were able to duplicate that and turn it into one of our commercial sourdough products. And as such, we analyzed what was inside of that sourdough, and that study was so interesting that we said, well, let's have a look on the biodiversity of what you find in Italian sourdoughs. And together with Professor Marco Gobetti from the university, he was working in Bari in those days. Today, he's also active in Bolzano in the north of Italy. And together with him, we started up that project of studying. We had in total 37 Italian sourdoughs from mainland Italy, Sicily, and Sardinia. And we discovered 400 different species or different strains of microorganisms, which was, we did not really expect that. We had no idea of this biodiversity. And little by little, we started looking deeper. And at the same moment, we got a colleague in Greece telling us, but my mother, she has a sourdough based on basil leaves. And so we looked into these sourdoughs, And then we had some examples from Hungary, and we ended up with this collection of 43 sourdoughs. We still had not the idea of creating a library. Now, the library itself is a non-for-profit initiative of our company because we can do it and we believe we should do it in order to acquire again that knowledge. Now, the three reasons why what we do here in this library is, first of all, preserve the biodiversity, protect the tradition or the heritage of sourdough, and last but not least, for the sourdoughs that we have here, they serve as a backup in case something would go wrong in the original bakery from where the sourdough is coming. And so as such, we have this, we have this 133 sourdough starters right now. Some of them, I will turn my camera. I will see if I can turn my camera. Yes. And I will start here with the last one. So this is the latest arrival that we had, is number 133. That's a sourdough coming from the United States. From if there's people from the US, well, probably the majority of you are in the US. That's from Panera Bread, probably a well-known bakery chain in the US. And as such, you see there is a couple of spots missing, but these sourdoughs still have to arrive. We know from who they are and from where they come, but they still didn't get here due to all these COVID issues. We couldn't get them all here already. But as such, you see that these sourdoughs, we keep them in the fridge at 4 degrees centigrade, which is just the normal fridge temperature. And as you can see, they have different colors. They have different, well, here you see that very well. You have a stiff one on the left, or at least on my left. I don't know how that translates on your screen, but the brown one, number 59, is a stiff sourdough from France. And the one on the right is, well, it's probably, you might know her. It's the sourdough from La Brea, from Nancy Silverstone. And you see that they have different consistencies. Some are very liquid, some are stiff. And so this collection of Italian sourdoughs that we started with, as I mentioned, gave us over 400 different strains of microorganisms. Today, we can say that we have, out of these 133, we have over 1,500 different strains. I'm gonna put back number 43 in the fridge. There we are. And these two sourdoughs are, for example, from Maison Kaiser, which is a bakery in Paris, but also a well-known bakery all over the world, because Eric Kaiser has shops all over the world. All French sourdoughs, as I said, here is from the United States. This one is from the Netherlands, from the UK. You see here an empty jar. Now, no. What did I do? The way to preserve the starters here in the library is that every 2 months we feed them with the original flour that the owners, and I say owners because these sourdoughs do not belong to us. We do not use them for commercial purpose. As I said in the beginning, it is a non-for-profit initiative, although that number 1, number 43, and number 69 that we have here, and number 101 are starters that belong to us and that we can eventually use for commercial purposes because they are ours, but all the rest do not belong to us, and we can only use them to study them and to have that backup here in case something would go wrong. Now, I was going to say, this is always the tricky part with these live things. When you switch to something else, you suddenly forget what you were saying. I lost a bit track of what I was doing.
You were refreshing them, Karl. You were talking
yes,
about use the same flour. Yes,
exactly. Thank you, Michelle. It's always good to have a backup. Now, we feed them every 2 months with the original flour. Now, when someone does not send the flour at a certain moment, I have to, I cannot maintain the starter, and we know that it's dead. And so we had an issue with the supply of that flour for one or another reason, and we had to let it go. Fortunately, from every starter that we get into the library, we collect actually 3 jars. So when I go to a country, or when it's too far, we have this nice collector box with cooling elements inside that guarantees a conservation of 96 hours, which is more than time enough from wherever it comes to get here in Belgium. And 1 jar is analyzed in one of our microbiological labs with stuff that we can do, meaning we measure the TTA, or the total amount of organic acids. We measure the pH. We measure the amount of lactic acid. We measure the amount of acetic acid, and these kind of things that we can do in-house. And then a 2nd jar is sent to the university in Italy, where, and that's the big part of the work. It takes almost 45 working days, more or less 3 months, on these kind of Petri dishes with different substrates to grow yeasts and to grow lactic acid bacteria. These Petri dishes are inoculated with sourdough that has been diluted, and then they start growing the colonies. And as such, when they see, and you can see that a colony of lactic acid bacteria grows different if it's a different species, and as such, they isolate them on different Petri dishes, and they build up an amount of Petri dishes until they are certain that all these colonies that are present in the sourdough are isolated. And then once they are isolated, we put them into little tubes like this, and then we store them in boxes like this, and they go in a freezer at minus 80 degrees, which is very cold. 80 degrees centigrade or Fahrenheit is almost the same. It's very cold. And as such, we preserve that biodiversity. So luckily, from starters, we always have the microorganisms. So if I would get that flour back here, we are able to resurrect a sourdough. I have another example there. You might see, I will take you a bit closer. You see here, jar number 51 is also an empty jar. And that's because it's a sourdough from France, from the region of Toulouse. And there, the problem was that it was a spelt sourdough, and the farmer actually stopped growing the spelt. And as such, the baker did not have the flour anymore, and yeah, couldn't send me the flour. So these are 2 exceptions of flours that did not get here on time in order to refresh the sourdough. But we do have the microorganisms that were present in there. So every 2 months, we feed them with the original flour, following the original recipe. Yeah? That's why you see that some are stiff, some are very liquid, some are in between. And that guarantees that the microorganisms that are present in the sourdough survive. Okay, we do not bake with those sourdoughs. Well, not during these refreshments, at least, because it's already very labor intensive when we have to feed these 133 starters. So we split that up into, we have divided them in 2. So 1 month we do 1 half, the next month we do the other half. So the week of the 3rd of June, from number 61 up to number 133 will be refreshed. And then in July, it will be back from 1 up to 60. And as such, it goes on and on and on. Now, that is not a system we invented. That's a system, or that's the protocol that we got from Professor Marco Gobetti in order to maintain the starters here in the library. And now, using the original flour is a kind of a guarantee, and only doing it once every 2 months is a guarantee that these starters are not evolving tremendously. We see some changes. We see that some families might be less dominant or become more dominant, but it's not like you see sometimes. I get questions or remarks on social media where people say, yes, but as soon as you open a jar of sourdough in another environment, it's contaminated and it's changing. Well, that's not the case. It doesn't go that fast, because if you have a mature starter that is well fed, that is in good health, it's containing billions or trillions of these microorganisms that have created their own environment in which they thrive optimally. And so it's very difficult for intruders to get in there, to survive, and to take over the place. I often compare a mature sourdough to a very nice city that exists already for thousands of years. Let's say the city of London was London 1,000 years ago and will be London in 1,000 years from now. The walls will be there. You will recognize that it is London. Some families might still be there, but some families might have gone or might be replaced or might be in less quantities or more quantities. And that's a bit how a sourdough can evolve. Last year, but due to COVID, we couldn't actually go on with it. We had to cancel, but we wanted to do an experiment where we would invite two bakers who deposit their starter in 2014, in 2015, 16, 17, 18, and 19, in order to compare what we have today in the sourdough library with what they have today in their bakery and what we received in those respective years. Excuse me. We couldn't go on with the experiment, but it's still something that is on our list, because we are curious to see, are these starters in a bakery the same, or have they evolved, and have they evolved differently than what we have here? And it's the thing you do in a library. You have a place where you can study all these different things, and I might come up with other examples later in this talk. So that's preserving the biodiversity of sourdough. Secondly, I mentioned that we protect the heritage, and the best example, and I will take another jar, the best example of protecting the heritage of sourdough is this jar illustrates everything. So what you see here is not a sourdough, but it's chickpeas. Now, this whole idea of creating a library was inspired by chickpeas. As I mentioned before, we had a collection of 43 starters in the company, and we were called by a baker in Lebanon who had a process of fermenting chickpeas. Now, fermenting chickpeas, if someone did not do it yet, you should try it and see what it does. Is you take this kind of erlenmeyer, you fill it with, I don't know the amounts, but like this with chickpeas. You add hot water, 60 degrees. 60 degrees is really hot water. And that you put in a place of 40 degrees centigrade, which is also very warm. And you keep that for 8 hours. And what is happening is that the microorganisms that are on the outside of the chickpeas, they start to ferment. And it's mainly yeasts that are created. And what you will see is that on top of the chickpeas will start to swell, and then you will see little bubbles of CO2 appear. They come to the surface and they create a kind of a white foam. This white foam looks like a bit of a meringue, egg white that you whip. You can remove that after 8 hours, and then you filter the water, because the chickpeas, you do not really need them. Some bakers only use the water, others they mix it and they use everything of it. And that is used to ferment. Now, the smell of these chickpeas is awful. it's a very complex and very unpredictable fermentation. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. In the summer of 2019, I went to Creta and to Turkey in order to make a movie about this fermentation. And I was supposed to go to that third baker in Lebanon, but again, with COVID, I had to cancel. But this movie will, sooner or later, we will release that movie showing how it is done. And that baker in Creta had always three jars prepared with these chickpeas, one in his house, one in one bakery. He had two bakeries, and one in the other bakery, because one or two of them was not certain to produce what he required. So it's a very unpredictable, and it's very complex to understand what is going on. And so those two sons of that baker in Lebanon, they said to their father, because they visited an exhibition in Paris, and they said, "Father, when we take over the bakery, we will switch to instant dry yeast instead of your chickpea fermentation." And that baker got a bit disappointed, and he was more or less upset, because he was sure that he was not going to convince his sons to continue with that process, that he called upon us and he said, "Look, you are a company, you exist for almost 100 years. I am going to give you my recipe. And when my sons realize that what they will do with yeast is not the same as what I and my ancestors have done with the chickpeas, they can come back to you and you have that recipe stored and you can explain them how this is done." So that was protecting his heritage. And that actually triggered us in order to protect the heritage of more than just the chickpea, but trying to protect sourdough heritage for the future, because we believe sourdough is a very important ingredient that should be reintroduced in bread baking all over the world. So that's the example of protecting. And then last but not least, I said the backup. Now, since 2013, the sourdough library exists, and I was always telling that we guarantee that we have a backup here, but I'd never had to use it until 2 months ago. In the beginning of March, I got a phone call from a baker in Denmark. His name is Hendrik, from whom this sourdough is. And he calls me on a Saturday morning or a Friday morning, I don't recall. I have him on the phone and he says, "Karl, I have an issue. My employee has used all my mother dough in the final dough. He made bread out of it and he didn't get a piece of the mother aside to feed it, to refresh it for tomorrow." So I came to the library, refreshed this sourdough and sent it back to Denmark. And today he has, well, the next day he had his mother culture back. So that's how we guarantee a backup. Now for Hendrik, it's very near to Belgium. I could have driven there by car if needed. For some countries, if I have to send back a sample to Australia, for instance, it might take a bit longer, but we do guarantee that we can send it back to their respective owners. So I will again switch my camera and continue a little bit where I left. I have here number 64 and 65 are starters from China, Australia, Spain, Portugal, Italy. This is actually a panettone starter that is around since 1923. Here I have the starters from San Francisco. Number 71 is from the San Francisco Baking Institute. 72 is a starter that is coming from the city of Guadalajara in Mexico to make a famous birote bread. Number 73 is from the biggest bakery panettone producer in Peru. 74 and 75 from Switzerland. 76, I said, is from Denmark. And then here, 77 up to 84 are all from the United States. Here we have 3 starters from Brazil, Spain, Germany, the Netherlands. This one is from, well, people might know her here. This is from my dear friend in the UK, Vanessa Kimball. This is from another friend in Singapore, William Wu. This is from Spain. 95. You see, 94 is empty. We know which sourdough it is, but it didn't reach. It should come from the Philippines, but it didn't reach the sourdough library yet. And then we have a sourdough from Austria, from Sao Paulo in Brazil. Then again, a couple of the United States. This one, 99, is from Michael Calanti from San Francisco. Here, I'm going to take it and give it a bit more light for you. This starter, number 100, is, and you might see that, I don't know if it's so visible, but this one is not made with flour, but it's made with cooked rice. And it's coming from the city of Tokyo in Japan. Number 101 is a traveling sourdough that is coming from Germany. It has even a name, and a book is written after him. It's called Vitus. And then 102 is Levain James. For those of you who know the famous book of modernist bread, well, Levain James is the sourdough that has been used by Nathan and Francisco in order to do the trials with sourdough breads. And then here I have another German sourdough. And then 104 is a starter from dating back to the Klondike Gold Rush. So going back to 1896 from the region of Seattle. It's today belonging to Will Grant, and he is the owner of a fantastic pizza place. And in 2017, he created the best pizza of the US. He won the Caputo Cup with pizzas made with this sourdough. This one is from Toronto, from Blackbird Bakery, if my souvenirs are right. This one is another one from the Klondike Gold Rush. It's from the great-great-grandfather of Ion Christensen, and he was one of the first pioneers doing the Klondike Gold Rush. This one is from Alaska. It's also sourdough that has been traveling to Chile, to New Zealand, but always got back to Canada. 108 is from a very nice pizzeria in Verona, and it's actually started with cow dung. I might come back to that later. And then here we have sourdoughs from Spain, from Turkey, some more from Turkey. 125 is from Anita Schumer from Sourdough Mania. People who are on Instagram or Facebook might know her. And then 128 is coming from Dubai. And then 130 is a gluten-free starter from Germany made of rice flour. This one is from Canada, from a retailer where they have a sourdough in the retail division, and they make amazing cinnamon rolls with it. And then, as I mentioned, 132, 133 are starters from Panera Bread in the US. And as such, this collection is getting broader and broader. Now, we do have a network of bakeries that we know from all around the world, through which we can collect sourdoughs. But in order to detect sourdoughs that we do not know that they exist, that are living in a remote area, in a household or in a school or in a restaurant, outside our network, we have developed a website, and the website is www, it's written here, the Quest for Sourdough, or questforsourdough.com. And on that website, everybody who has a starter at home can register it in our online database, sharing the name of the sourdough, because it's important to give a name to your sourdough, the ingredients you use in there, a little bit of history, describe your sourdough. You can even create the flavor profile of how it tastes. You can upload pictures of what you bake with it. It's a place where you can share or make your little inventory of sourdough or sourdoughs if you have more than one. And as such, we try to motivate people to share their sourdough and create that community feeling of showing to others what you are doing in order to exchange ideas and inspire each other. And for us, it is a source of potential candidates to bring in here to become part of this collection, and as such become part of a study, okay? The study of the microorganisms that are inside, but also these sourdoughs can, and for the moment there is several of these sourdoughs are part of scientific studies that are going on in Italy, in Spain, in Switzerland, in Belgium, in the UK, in order to check mainly the impact of sourdough bread on the digestibility, on the gut health, on the nutritional values, and so on, because that will give us a lot of information that we can share with bakeries all around the world in order to promote a positive message about bread. Voila, I think that is more or less what I wanted to tell you. I guess we still have plenty of time. I didn't wear my watch, but I think we still have plenty of time to do question and answers. Feel free to ask anything as long as it's about sourdough and not about my favorite food or whatever. Let's go for it. So Michelle, I don't know if you have many questions.
Oh, yes.
Or
yes, and you've answered a lot of them along the way. But again, I'll as I ask them, for those of you who are watching YouTube, throw it in the YouTube chat box if you have a question, and then on Zoom, the Q&A box that you see down at the bottom there, click on that, throw a question in there. Where to begin? So I guess I'll start with where you kind of left off, where with the Quest for Sourdough website, folks can enter their information. You then use that information to potentially find candidates to move into your freezer, or not freezer, yes, your fridge. What is that process like? What does it take to make it into the sourdough?
Yes, that's a good question. Actually, I didn't mention that. Now there is one basic rule to become a candidate. To enter in the library, the starter has to be made from a spontaneous fermentation, meaning that it cannot contain any commercial starter culture that is used, because we know what is in these commercial starter cultures, and these do not contribute to the biodiversity of sourdough. And next to that, we have a list of parameters that we check. For example, what kind of flour is used? Where is the sourdough coming from? Is there a story linked to the sourdough? How old is the sourdough? These parameters, they are not hierarchical. We use them in order to evaluate each and every sourdough. I'm giving an example. So we have in total 39 starters from Italy. If tomorrow an Italian baker contacts us and says, "Wow, I have this amazing sourdough and I would like to have it in the sourdough library," we will look what kind of flour is used. If he's using wheat flour, the chances to get another Italian wheat sourdough in the collection is small, because we have already 39. If that baker would have a whole wheat or a rye, his chances are increasing. If tomorrow someone from Panama is telling me that he or she has a starter based on wheat flour, well, the chances are bigger to get in the library than if it's coming from a country where we already have a collection. So the more sourdoughs we have from one region, we become more picky, if I can use that word, in order to select the sourdoughs to enter in the library.
Right. Yeah, perfect. And I'll follow up with Karen's question here too, which is related. I'm sure that how you can tell if these starters are mature. I'm sure that falls into the categories you were just talking about, that they have to age their starter before they.
Well, we have this unwritten rule actually, that a starter should be at least 5 years old before entering in the library.
That's mature.
Yeah. Yes, yes. And we also want a minimum guarantee that it's not a starter that has been created like last year or still during COVID. Many starters have been created by people who suddenly have time, who discover sourdough, but who probably will not continue once everything is getting, I'm not going to say back to normal, but when situation will become a bit like it was before, then a lot of people will abandon probably. So we are looking for these starters from that we know will be there for the coming 10, 20, 50 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Another question related to potential research that y'all are doing out of the lab too. It comes from Peter Reinhardt. I'm not surprised at all by his question here. He's curious that have they ever been baked with? Have you ever taken starters out and baked with them to compare flavor?
Yes, to be honest, I haven't done it with all of them. Okay, it's just 133 starters. That if you want to bake with that, it's already a big work when we fed these 130. In the past, when we had like 120, we were feeding them all at the same time, and that was 4 days of feeding 3 times, because every starter is fed 3 times before we put it back in the fridge. So that's a lot of work, and I guarantee you that when you finish mixing the last one, the only thing you want to do is to go home, to relax, and to think about something else than to bake. But it happened that sometimes I took a couple of buckets home and I baked with it. And also here, we have done already some comparative trials with sourdoughs when we look at the analysis and say, oh, this one has a different yeast, this one is nice with the consortium of lactic acid bacteria. And we did some baking trials with 10, let's say. And yes, we've seen differences. Sometimes you see big differences. You can place them in different flavor groups. Some are fruity, some are cereal, some are acidic, some are lactic, some are fermented. So yes, we do it, but not on a regular base and not on a consistent way.
Right. And along with that, second part to Peter's question here was asking about the grains. Do you find that there's a relationship with some starters being better used with rye or other grains or etc.? Quite a few people are asking about rye, actually. If you have any thoughts about rye, go nuts.
Well, to be honest, I am allergic to rye flour. You
should have hazard pay then. You are
in the beginning of 2019. They had to call an ambulance here. They had to drag me to the hospital because I was giving a workshop, and some of my colleagues who had no idea I was allergic to rye, I was teaching them how to work with sourdough and so on, and everybody was making his own sourdough bread. But in the evening, when we had to shape the breads, some people started to use a lot of dusting to dust like through a sieve with rye. Rye is very volatile, and I got an asthma attack. I couldn't bear. I thought I was going to die that night. But okay,
oh my gosh,
everything went well. So I'm avoiding a little bit rye.
we can pass on those questions. Yeah.
But no. But it's interesting to see, and rye bread is a completely different world than the wheat breads. When you make rye bread, the rules that you use when you make wheat bread are not valid at all. A rye bread, you do not have to develop a gluten network because you cannot. There are not enough proteins and not the right proteins in order to make that gluten network that makes kind of this balloon in the bread that is keeping and retaining the gas, which make your bread nice and rising. In rye, you don't have that, so you don't have to mix for a long time. You don't have to do long bulk fermentations. The only thing you need to make sure is that you have enough acidity in rye bread. So there is a whole, there are rules of how am I sure that my rye bread in the end is not going to, when I bake it and I slice it, when it's cooled down, how do I avoid that these slices stick together? Probably if someone has already experimented with rye bread, this is one of the biggest issues, that the rye bread tends to stick together after you cut it. And that is for the simple reason that probably the dough was not acidified enough. That's why the Germans, they have developed they have studied sourdough for so many years in order to, how do I acidify my sourdough as much as possible so that I can use as little as possible in my production and still am sure that my bread is getting baked properly. When it comes to rye sourdough, we see, so there is all these little tips and tricks. You don't, when you have a starter, you don't need to feed it constantly with the same flour. It's like us. If you would have to eat spaghetti meatballs every day, I think that after 5 days, you will be fed up and you want something else. These microorganisms, I don't think that they do not think, but they react the same. When you see that a starter is getting like losing fermentation power, is not behaving the way it was, you can feed it with a different kind of flour from time to time. And rye flour is something that revives and increases the fermentation power of a starter tremendously on the short term. I'm not saying on the long term, because the same will happen when you keep on feeding. And that's the thing with sourdough. Making a sourdough is easy, but maintaining one in a stable way is very complex, because you have all these microorganisms. They behave differently depending on the temperatures. They produce lactic acid, they produce acetic acid, they fight with the yeasts. So it's always very complex to control that. Yeah? And so rye is a completely different ball game that needs different rules.
Well, speaking about different rules and really complex starters, I have several questions in the chat here about the starter you mentioned that was started with manure. So let's have
yes.
story.
Yes. So yeah, and boom, there is not one. It's not written in stone. There is no transmission of why and how people did it, but it is like this, one of these traditions in Italy where they use, well, yeah, you call it manure, cow shit. I said cow shit. My English, I'm not a native English speaker, so I use what I learned from Bruce Willis. So they use it. Now they collect dried manure after the winter that they soak in water. It's filtered, so there is no shit actually going in the mix with flour. It's very well filtered, so they use the water. Now that water is full of bacteria. Now I have a theory. I don't know if that is correct, but that is my theory. If we look in nature, there's only two animals that can digest grains, and that is cows and goats. So it could be that our ancestors have had that idea, that they noticed that, and that they started using that, because they said, well, if they can eat grains, they might have, I don't know if they were aware of microorganisms, but we have those microorganisms in our intestine as well, these lactic acid bacteria that take care of the digestion. The only thing is that the grain, when you eat a grain as such, the amount of time it is in our body is too short to be digested. So in sourdough, you start that digestion already. And that could be one of the reasons. So that water coming from the manure, the dried manure, is used to make sourdough. Now, when you make sourdough, you mix the flour and water. The lactic acid bacteria, they start to turn the sugars into lactic acid and acetic acid, and those acids are lowering the pH. And we know that Mother Nature has decided that when the pH gets below 4.2, that all pathogens are probably killed. Yeah, so that's the beauty about fermentation. Once you have that low pH, well, it doesn't matter if you used, well, the Italians use cow manure, the French, they use honey or a grated apple or fermented raisins. The Greeks, they use basil leaves. The Japanese guys, they use rice. So there's so many ways to make sourdough, and not one of the, or not two of these sourdoughs that we have here in the library have the same composition. They are all unique, a bit like humans. And depending on the type of flour, from where they come, the weather, the climate, the soil where the grain was coming from, all that has an influence on the final result of that sourdough. And depending on how the sourdough is dealt with, it can still change, a bit like us, okay? We are humans, but if you are well fed and if you are okay, you are happy. If you are hungry and you live in an area where it's too cold, and you are going to get unhappy, and you will behave completely different. The same thing is with the sourdough.
Yeah, shift in environment can have all these different effects on the variables that all come together to make this thing. It's incredible.
Absolutely.
Karl, there are so many questions in here. I'm going to put Karl's Twitter link in the chat. So if
wait, don't do I'm not very active on Twitter. Okay. I prefer my Instagram.
Okay.
If you would put my Instagram, I'm not a journalist. I'm not a Twitter. I'm not into the Twitter world. I do have an account, but it's I barely use it. But on my Instagram, I am
I've got you here.
more active. If I get because I do get a lot of questions, sometimes I cannot answer everything at once. It might take a while, but I will have a look at them.
Well, Karl, I can speak for everybody here. I appreciate so much you joining us, especially late tonight.
Is the hour or is it over already?
Yes, no, we're finished already.
Oh my God. Yes. Well, time flies if you're having fun. Eh?
This is a brilliant talk. I'll just quickly, before we end the seminar here, I just want to quickly plug the next one that's coming up too, which is in a few weeks. It's going to be on June 10th. And this is going to be our last fermentology webinar for the spring and the summer. Question marks in the air about how we're going to continue it, but don't worry, as Rob mentioned before, there's always a project coming up, so there'll be more information coming with that. But Aviaha is joining us, and she's an Inuit microbiologist, and I've spoke with Aviaha before, and she has this incredible talk about Inuit practices of preserving meats, and it's phenomenal. She says it's from stomach contents of the caribou to seabirds and seal skins. It's a great talk, so make sure you look out for that one. That's again June 10th. And yeah, again, Karl, thank you so much for your expertise. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome, Michelle. It was my pleasure. Whenever you need me, you know where to find me.
On Instagram.
In the library or on Instagram. Yes. All right.
Thank you so much, Karl. Have a great night.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.